The more we can incorporate these into our vegetable gardens, the less pesticides we have to use, or the less other types of pest control methods are required.
Native plants can play an important role in farm resilience. Creative farmers can use native plants in the farmscape to provide benefits such as biological pest control, bioremediation, and erosion control. In this episode of Voices from the Field, Eric Fuselier, an environmental project manager at the Arkansas and Oklahoma civil engineering firm Crafton Tull, shares his knowledge of native plants and their benefits with NCAT agriculture specialist Nina Prater. Eric and Nina also talk about different ways farmers could create profitable enterprises with native plants, such as native forage species for livestock, native food crops, native cut flower production, or herbal medicines. Let's listen.
Hello, I'm Nina Prater with NCAT's Southeast office here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I'm joined today by Eric Fuselier, and we are going to talk about native plants and the many ways that we can use them in our farmscape. So thank you for joining me today in person.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's good to have a little bit of some pre-COVID normalcy, but
yeah, it is really nice. So let's just jump right in. Can you give me a little background on who you are, where you work, and how you got involved and interested in native plants?
Well, definitely. I work for Crafton Tull as an environmental project manager. I've been there for almost 3 years, but I've been doing environmental consulting for going on 8 years. One of the things I do with my job is I help our engineers and landscape architects with selecting native plant species for our projects. These include low impact development projects with rain gardens, detention ponds, bioswales. We do these projects for commercial developments and residential development, neighborhoods, things like that. I also serve as, this year I'm serving as the president of the Arkansas Native Plant Society. I've been able to kind of take this passion and apply it in that role and helping do a lot of outreach and promote the use of native plants. And while the Native Plant Society is a little more focused on the conservation and education of the native plants in their natural habitat, there's another organization also heavily involved in one called Wild Ones Native Plants Natural Landscapes, and that is a national organization that has chapters all around the country with volunteers and members. And I chartered the local chapter here in Northwest Arkansas called the Ozark chapter, and also serve on the national board for Wild Ones. And so, whereas the Native Plant Society, as I mentioned, is more about conserving native plants and educating people on the native plants and their natural habitats, Wild Ones has more of a focus on promoting the use of native plants in the built environment or the landscaped environment.
Interesting. I didn't know about that distinction. Those are both really important, directions to
Definitely.
take, preserving the ecosystems, the natural ecosystems, but then also allowing the native plants back into these developed landscapes.
Definitely. I mean, it's this change in landscape use that has such an impact on the ecosystem. So it's kind of a two-way interplay between those two, because the natural habitats provide as a seed source for local ecotypes for the native plants that we want to use in the built environment. But then whenever these areas are developed and they go from either a natural area into an agricultural area, or a natural area turned into a urban or suburban area, then there's a lot of that those native plant species that are removed and eliminated, and so that creates kind of a hole or an ecological desert, so to speak, for local pollinators and wildlife. And so the more development we have and land use change we have, the harder it is for these insect populations and ultimately the other wildlife that relies on these native plants as the base of the food chain to survive. And habitat becomes much more fragmented. So One way that we can help patch back in, or as I like the word, weave back in the some of the threads of the web of life, is to use native plants in our urban, suburban, and agricultural environment. This helps support insect populations and ultimately other like birds that rely on these insects. Deer oftentimes rely on native plants. There are other wildlife that it supports the whole the web of life. So.
Right, it's the base of the pyramid,
Exactly. Yep.
The plants, and then from there the insects and up. Yeah, and I think people are slowly starting to become aware of insect, like they call it, what do they call it? The insect Armageddon or something.
Yes.
And then the bird populations.
There's been a decline there over the last several decades.
Yeah.
There's a significant decline. And, I mean, you think about the monarchs. They traditionally, historically, would they leave this little mountain range in Mexico at the end of the winter, early spring, and they start migrating north. They make it so far, like a population might make it to Arkansas, and then they look for milkweed plants to lay their eggs on. And then once those eggs hatch, become caterpillars, and then later become adult butterflies, and they continue that migration pattern north. Might find another milkweed plant in northern Missouri or Iowa, and then so on. And then at the end of the year, they start to migrate back down to Mexico. So it's this multi-generational journey each year along the flyway from Mexico to the northern United States, southern Canada, and then back to that mountain range in Mexico. And they rely on those milkweed plants that, for millennia were there to support them in that migration. But here, with a lot of land use changes we've had, removing milkweeds, pesticide use, these milkweed populations have significantly declined along that flyway, and that has resulted in a decline in the monarch populations. Another species that would be has been directly impacted by the land use changes are northern bobwhite quail. A lot of people recall hearing these quail, all the time 30 years ago. But with the removal of so much of their native habitat, which they do heavily rely on native plants for the grubs and insects to feed their young, to find cover in, and to raise the next generation of the quail, we've seen a significant decline just in the past 30 years that has been attributed, and I think even within the last 10 years, especially here in Arkansas, that has been attributed to that loss of habitat. So.
Right. So it's really important for all of us in whatever way we can I like the language you use, to weave those connections back,
Reweaving the threads of the web of life.
Yeah, it's, because if we have any small piece of land, you can have an impact on these populations.
Even if you live in an apartment. I first started growing native plants in containers when I lived in an apartment, and it's just about knowing which species could handle shade if you have a balcony, or partial sun, or full sun if you have a south-facing apartment patio. But yeah, it's there's usually a native plant species that you can find for any sort of condition depending on the site.
Right.
So.
I found a great quote about biodiversity, and which, native plants, I mean, there's a huge range of native plants that, talking about native plants is a pretty big umbrella.
Yes.
But I found this quote that I think people will like. It says, "Conservation is not just about building another terrace. It's sharing the land with 100,000 other species." And this was said by Paul Johnson, the former NRCS chief.
Okay.
And
I like that.
It's, and so I think a lot of times when people think about, soil conservation or natural resource conservation, we think about putting up a terrace to stop erosion, or these sort of physical designs, or, elements we can impose on the landscape. But it's really so much more complicated than that.
Right.
And so much more beautiful than that.
Yes.
Sharing our land and our space, our farms, we are sharing them with, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of species.
Yes.
When you're talking about plants and insects and amphibians and birds and all of that beautiful life. And so I think I'm excited to dive into some ways that people can do that with you today, because it's so important. So, I talk about the 5 soil health principles a lot with farmers at workshops and things. And one of those is that is really critical to the whole piece of like building soil health is maximizing biodiversity in our farmscapes. Because diversity above ground leads to diversity below ground.
Right.
And that leads to a really resilient farm system, because if you've got a lot of things going, and say you have a drought year, at least you'll get income from something.
Exactly. And that's really like the biodiversity. The natural ecosystem works the same way. It does help our ecosystems become more resilient to environmental stressors.
Right.
Because when the more different species of plants, native species that we have, the more different species of insects are going to be supported. The more species of birds, mammals, and other wildlife are going to be supported. The same concept would apply there as well. And if we think about how much the economic benefit that pollinators provide for farms through pollination services,
right?
If we aren't supporting these pollinators, then ultimately it's going to be a lot more expensive to go out and pollinate our crops.
Right.
These insects provide a free service to us, and so the more that we can take care of them, the more that
higher yields and all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it really is in our interest.
Okay, so what makes a native plant a native plant?
Well, it gets really complicated if you want to really dig into it, but a simple working definition is that a plant species is native to the region where it evolved. So many of our ornamental plants and cultivars that we have been using over the past several centuries are not from North America, and so they have not evolved here. They have not developed those special relationships with the other parts of the ecosystem. We mentioned the pollinators and wildlife, so they're not part of the local ecology. So the plants that are native to our region have been co-evolving here for millennia. And they, come to support species which depend on these plants for food or to complete their life cycle. So we mentioned how, songbird species rely heavily on caterpillars to feed their young. So without a lot of the native wildflowers that support butterfly and moth populations, these caterpillars would not be there for these birds to feed their young, and then that has a cascading effect on bird populations.
Right.
And then there are other things that rely maybe on birds or certain birds for food and whatnot. And so since native plants form that base of that pyramid, when we remove them or significantly reduce them, it does have cascading effects on the other populations in the ecosystem.
Right. And so the replacing them with non-natives is creating what you said earlier, like
ecological desert, so to speak. It's just, like if you had a buffet, that was out, and then suddenly you replace it with, a parking lot or, a building or, a field with plants that you can eat, it's like that. And suddenly, then you'd have to go somewhere else and then maybe even compete with other populations in those areas.
Right. And I know that these non-natives have the potential to become invasive if they don't have the predators or the things that consume them to keep their numbers intact.
Like the checks, on their population.
Right.
So we see that with Japanese honeysuckle, kudzu, a lot of these species that started off as either ornamental or used for erosion control, before we really realized the impact that they would have in the ecosystem. But since we started to see, these things really get out of hand and they replace not just native populations, but they can become a nuisance in themselves to land managers.
Right.
So that's one reason why if we stick to native species, then we are reducing the amount of invasive species. Because, even some of the ornamentals we're choosing now, we may not realize, but until later, that they might become invasive. Like think about Bradford pear trees, and we still see those being used, and those are horribly invasive. Especially right around here, the Ozarks in March, and you see them all in bloom, and you really can see how many of them are around, especially on fence rows, where they're not being able to be managed easily or cut down.
Yeah. So stick with the natives. You'll be better off.
Definitely. And there are beautiful natives that can be used ornamentally. I think that's the thing is Just getting the public on board when it comes to ornamentals, just like purple coneflower, a lot of our milkweeds, butterfly milkweed. Not only do you get to see that beautiful flower, like a black-eyed Susan, or but then you get to enjoy more birds visiting your yard, more butterflies. I mean, it really does enhance the aesthetics of a property or storefront or anywhere you're wanting to use these.
Yeah, it really does. So what are some creative ways that farmers can use native plants on their land?
Oh, well, one that might directly apply to agriculture would be for pest control. We did talk about how native plants, attract pollinators. So, there's the pollination services that, having native plants planted within your orchard or within your, on the borders of your crop fields, so, that's going to attract pollinators that will eventually attract, those pollinators eventually start to visit the crops as well. So you can, select species that will attract the specific pollinators you might need depending on what you're growing. But not only that, but a lot of these pollinators and other insects that they attract act as pest control for other insects that, people working in agriculture don't want, such as aphids, beetle larvae, leaf hoppers, mealybugs, mites, that sort of thing. So like something like this common yarrow attracts a wide range of beneficial insects that will then later consume and eat a lot of those pests.
Right.
Black-eyed Susans are another great one for pest control. Daisy fleabane, Ohio spiderwort. There's been some great research done by Heather Home where she has looked at a lot of the common pests that vegetable growers struggle with, and then the native insects that act as pest control on those pesky insects, and then which native species attract those beneficial insects. And so the more we can incorporate these into our vegetable gardens, the less pesticides we have to use, or the less other types of pest control methods are required, and it's let the plants do their work for you. It's less effort on our part. And, we get aphids out at our place, and then I just leave them alone at first, and then I start noticing the ladybugs start showing up, and then there's no more aphids. So it's a little bit of of a delay, but it doesn't, but not too terribly long.
Right.
So it's people just need to realize if they just wait a few days, give the ecosystem its time to work itself out, and a lot of these pests are going to be taken care of as long as you have enough native species to attract the beneficial insects.
Right. And that ties into another soil health principle, which is minimize chemical disturbance.
Right.
So I always encourage people to design their farm to encourage biological control of pests.
Correct.
So that's what we're talking about.
When we think about how many of these insects start off as larvae in the soil, and the more we're using pesticides that might be soil active, or might have that effect on soil biology, it's going to impact the amount of beneficial insects that they might have on their property as well.
Right. Yeah. So it all ties together.
Yes.
It's a web.
And this is what people traditionally had. People don't realize this is a very traditional way of farming. We didn't have lawns 200 years ago. We had fields of a lot of native grasses and whatnot, and so that was it is part of how things used to be. This idea of this 20th century method that we had with the pesticides and the replacing our fields with lawns or non-native grass pastures. It's had a cascading effect on other elements of the ecosystem, and almost has perpetuated a perception of an increased need for the pesticides. Because the more or less people are educated on that, or have forgotten how it used to be, the more they might think that they need to go buy a pesticide to zap some bugs, that might be a pest. But,
kill the dandelions in their lawn.
Exactly.
It's like,
becomes a
what's
positive
wrong with
feedback loop.
dandelions?
Right.
Yeah, we need. I think we need a pro biodiverse lawn group.
Definitely. And that's what One Thing Wild Ones is all about. We're trying to educate people and encourage people to, create more natural living landscapes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So farmers can use native plants for pollinator habitat and beneficial insect habitat. What are some other ways that farmers can use native plants in their land?
Well, there's forage grasses. We have a lot of native grasses that make great forage grasses for cattle. Traditionally, this is what was used for a long time. It's a lot of the native grasses that existed on the prairies here, in America, were these native grasses that fed, bison and, other large, mammals. For some that would, work well here in the Ozarks, and for a lot of the the central and Midwest are going to be a lot of our native warm season grasses like big blue stem, little blue stem, or Indian grass, or if you have a low area, then switchgrass or eastern gamma grass. Switchgrass it is not only grown as a forage grass, but it's because of its high growth rate. It grows so fast and it produces so much biomass. It's also being grown as a biofuel crop.
Right.
So, switchgrass has a lot of other benefits besides just forage and biofuel. But like your big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, these are going to be more heat and drought tolerant. So
yeah.
They, like I said, they grow really fast, produce a lot of biomass, and so because of that, they're also just great for erosion control.
Okay. Yeah.
Switchgrass, it sucks up a lot of nutrients. If people were to plant that grass, say, along riparian areas, or if you have a stream or waterway or a ditch that borders a field where you might be applying fertilizer, manure. First of all, anytime you have a heavy rain, that switchgrass is going to help slow down or any sediment that might be in runoff. It's real thick and bushy. Help it become deposited before you lose it. For farmers, soil is your income.
Exactly.
You need to keep your soil. But not only that, but because it grows so fast, it's pulling up so much nutrients. So it's great for reducing the amount of nutrients that are entering streams and waterways. And as a lot of us know, that when you have too many nutrients in a local waterway, that leads to ecological issues like eutrophication.
Exactly.
So
slowing the water down, settling the sediments, capturing the nutrients, that's a lot of benefits for the natural waterways and around ponds or streams or anything like that. It could be used.
Yep.
That's great. So speaking of water management on a farm, a lot of farms have barns and different farm buildings and things like that. And you've done a lot of work with rain gardens. Can you explain what a rain garden is and how you use native plants in rain gardens?
Certainly. A rain garden is basically just a shallow depression planted with native perennial vegetation that is strategically located at the outfall of, say, where stormwater runoff is exiting an impervious surface. So that could be at the near the downspout of a gutter, that's accepting stormwater off of a roof. If you have an impervious surface like a road or driveway, something like that. If you near your barns, you get a heavy rain, water comes down off the roof and might be transported through the gutter to a particular corner of that barn. You can create like a shallow depression and choose specific species that will help suck up that rainwater, make use of that rainwater, but can also help purify or improve the water quality of that water before it enters into our local waterways. So it helps slow it down, capture it and facilitates more infiltration into the soil profile. And so there's a wide range of benefits that native plants provide when it comes to improving water quality. I mean, there's a lot of our prairie grasses have very fibrous root systems. And so that makes them great for breaking down organic contaminants like petroleum products or pesticides, stuff like that. So all plants have the ability to facilitate the breakdown of low to moderate levels of petroleum contamination and stormwater runoff. So if you have a parking lot, say, with engine oil been dripping, or if you have an area on your farm where you typically work on equipment and whatnot, well, when it rains, if there's an impervious surface there, it's going to pick up some of the petroleum, and it might be contained in the runoff. That might have a negative effect on aquatic ecosystems. So what plants can do is they exude a lot of sugars and whatnot from their roots, and this stimulates microbial activity in the soil. And petroleum product, being a hydrocarbon, is actually food for some species of microorganisms. And so they will metabolize that and help break it down into less toxic or non-toxic substances. But all plants can do that, but some plants do it better than others. And the reason for that is that some plants have thicker root systems, like a taproot or like a tree with a larger root. And so the root zone, the volume of soil that is taken up by the root zone is less for those species than say many of our native prairie grasses like big blue stem switchgrass that have these very fibrous roots. And so these very fibrous roots have a greater surface area taken up by the root zone or the rhizosphere within the volume of soil underneath it. So they are providing more of that benefit of breaking down these organic contaminants when we use these species.
I think that's really great for people to think about. Like, not only can these plants just support life above ground, but they can protect, our natural waterways from these contaminants. A lot of people on farms have tractors, not everybody. So,
you have equipment,
and they're not always in the best shape. So sometimes they leak. And, as even with our good intentions of being sustainable farmers, it's hard to get away from petroleum products, but strategically locating these catch zones kind of, with these native grasses could be a good way to
definitely, yes.
Prevent doing off-farm damage.
Right, and the same could be applied with the nutrients. I mean, if you strategically locate it or have a pond that's, going to capture stormwater runoff before it enters a stream, you can use species that are going to help suck up those nutrients or also break down any contaminants or maybe they're pesticides that were historically applied, like an orchard or somewhere. And there's going to be heavy metals sometimes associated with that contamination of the soil. So, native phreatophytes, which are species that have these deep roots or roots that rely heavily on groundwater to support themselves, are great for, they tend to grow fast and they produce, a lot of biomass, things like black willow, eastern cottonwood, box elders. These are great species for pulling up heavy metals that might be nutrients for these plants or pulling up excess nutrients in that stormwater. So using these types of species or just especially along the edge of a farm pond, along a riparian area, along a stream, is really going to help improve water quality both on your farm and downstream.
Okay, that was phreatophytes.
Phreatophytes, Phreatophytes.
That is a new word for me. I haven't heard that one before. I'm going to have to read about that.
They tend to be found in either wet areas or very arid areas like in the desert. So, here in, the eastern central United States, these are more likely to be found in these wet areas. But if you are in the Southwest or somewhere it's much more dry, a lot of phreatophytes are going to be found. You're going to have, some of the more arid region phreatophytes out there. Because they are woody species with this high growth rate, what Well, let me back up. Traditionally, if you're trying to remediate heavy metal contamination in soil and you use herbaceous species, well, you have to harvest those herbaceous species afterwards. Otherwise,
and then remove them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That can be done by either composting them or burning them in a safe way to capture any contaminants.
Like arsenic and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Lead, you don't want it to become volatile and in the atmosphere.
Right.
But with the woody species, especially when it comes to poplars and willows, it's becoming sequestered in the biomass of the tree. So as it grows, it's sucking up a lot of heavy metal, but then it becomes sequestered. So, that's another alternative that you wouldn't have to go back and harvest it each year.
Oh,
By using those species.
interesting.
Only concern is sometimes those heavy metals can make it into pollen. So, there's a concern there, and research is being done on how to prevent it from entering the trophic chain.
Right.
So they've created these hybrid poplar and willow species that I believe don't produce any sort of, can't remember if it's flowers or pollen or something like that. They're pretty much sterile. So, and that just prevents those heavy metals from entering the trophic chain.
Okay.
That way.
And then eventually, do you have to remove the wood? Just not every year?
If it's a full-on what's called phytoremediation, or using plants to remediate soil, then a lot of times, depending on the contaminant, they might let it grow for a while, and they'll fence it off to prevent deer to get in there. You don't want herbivory on, stuff like that. That's another way that those contaminants might enter the food chain or the trophic chain in the ecosystem. But for something that's on the level that's not like a brownfield site or a former industrial site or a place of a toxic chemical spill, that sort of thing, if you're just talking about a farm, then typically you can just leave that there.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about more lower levels of contamination that,
Right.
Still has a cumulative effect, as we have more farm activity on the landscape. But locally, it's, a less rate, a lower rate of these contaminants.
Right. That makes sense.
Right.
So, we've got forage species,
Pest control.
Beneficial habitat, pollinators, erosion control, nutrient pollution control. These native plants can do a lot, and we're not even done.
Oh no.
Because there's
a lot of uses.
So, forage is one way that farmers could actually make money off of native plants. There's a lot of other ways.
Yeah, there's a lot of native species that it can be grown as food crops. Pawpaws are the largest native fruit bearing plant here in North America. There are more cultivated type varieties that will produce pawpaws that have a longer shelf life. A lot of what has prevented pawpaws from becoming a more commercially viable fruit is they tend to have a short shelf life. But that's not to say that they can't still be sold locally at farmers markets or be included with CSAs, that sort of thing. And you think about a lot of our agricultural species that are berries are native here to North America. We talk about strawberries. That's a Native American berry. The wild strawberries, we have a lot of those growing out at our property. And every year in June, we really enjoy picking the wild strawberries.
They have the best flavor.
Yeah, it's like a giant strawberry, but or it's small, but it's like a normal store-bought strawberry. All of it condensed down into a smaller fruit.
Oh yeah.
And so, whereas a lot of store-bought strawberries, you often have that bland white part. These are just pure strawberry flavor. So when you have a bowl of those, it's just we also share it with this box turtle population that likes to visit our property every June. We notice them in there eating the strawberries, but there's usually plenty to go around for both of us. Wild raspberries, wild blackberries, the native varieties are going to have more thorns, but there are, of course, thornless cultivars that have been created. Wild blueberries, and the muscadines. That's a native grape species here in the southern United States. That is often grown commercially. So muscadine wine, muscadine grape juice, that might be another option to grow. The wild species I find are just as delicious as some of the more cultivated varieties. So
Yeah,
we
they're
also,
so good.
yes, we have a few different species of native passion fruit here in North America. I mean, one of the more common ones, especially here in the Ozarks, is going to be Passiflora incarnata.
Okay.
But that's the same. You know, a lot of people see the flowers, you know, passion flowers. They have those real stringy looking petals. You know,
Very beautiful.
very beautiful.
Very sort of alien, though.
They look like they don't belong here. They're really,
Yeah.
you know, they're related to those tropical passion fruit, which are grown more agriculturally. You know, when you see passion fruit juice, I mean, that's typically what you have. But I mean, the flavor of these our native passion fruits is just the same. It's delicious. One of my favorite wild edibles. So I mean, I'd like to, you know, I think that these could definitely be grown, especially, you know, for more local markets, you know, for some income.
Right.
So, and then there's the medicinal properties that passion vine provides as, for anxiety, as a sedative, mild sedative. I mean, it does. You know, you go to a lot of herbal or health food stores, and sometimes you'll see passion leaf, you know, the medicinal herbs section. So that's, you know, another option, you know, that it could be grown for. I mean, but above ground vine regrows each year, so harvesting it isn't going to harm the population as long as the underground roots are left intact to regrow the next year. And you know, there's different herbs and spices. Mountain mints are delicious. One of our native mints that also support a lot of variety of insect populations. I mean, I think that one's not you know thought of enough when it comes to growing mints. I mean, you can be growing a field of that, say, to be supporting insect populations, and then when it reaches the end of its, you know, year, you can harvest it and use the leaves, dry them, and mix delicious peppermint tasting tea. There's wild oregano, or also known as dittany, that my wife and I like to collect, and she'll make a delicious pizza sauce out of that, and it's just like oregano. And wild bergamots, one of our bee bombs, I believe Monarda fistulosa, I believe is its Latin name. But yeah, that's another great one. But not only that, I mean, we talked about trees and shrubs, and we mentioned pawpaws, but I mean, slippery elms. I mean, those are a lot of times considered a pest tree, but out in agricultural areas, I mean, where you might have a lot of them growing, just consider that the inner bark, you know, it has been used in the past for throat lozenges. You know, you can make a tea with the inner bark, help with upset stomach, sore throats, indigestion, digestive irritation, stomach ulcers, coughs. I mean, a wide range of medicinal properties. So, I mean, that's something that could also be harvested and sold to like health food stores or herbal places that sell herbal remedies. Persimmons, I mean, that's another one.
Oh, yeah. I love persimmons.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're looking for something to, you know, sell to the farmer's market in late summer, early fall, you know, like around October here is when they start to get ripe, you know, and that, or sugar maples for syrup even. Pecans are native to North America.
Right.
You know, that's one of our native nut trees that would be great, you know, for people to grow. I mean, you think about each one of those nuts is there because there was a flower that was pollinated, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, well, those actually might be wind pollinated now, think of it, but it still provides habitat and other benefits for wildlife.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, birds and whatnot live in its trees.
Squirrels.
Yes.
I just learned from a kid's nature show that blue jays eat huge amounts of acorns.
Oh, really? Huh.
They can, like, store them in their pouches.
Oh, wow.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Wildcrats. Thank you, PBS Kids.
My daughter loves Wildcrats. Yes.
It's a great show. But, I mean, we're talking about supporting bird populations,
Exactly.
you know, oak trees. So I guess that's not...
Yeah. Well, oaks are really important for, pollinators. I mean, they may be wind pollinated, but they support a lot of other insects as its host plant. Wild cherries, you know, a lot of the hickories, maples. I mean, these are great for just supporting wide ranges of different numbers of beneficial insects in life. I mean, they find more species living on those when they do a survey of an oak tree than they would on a lot of our other non-native ornamental trees. So, I mean, these are just great options for helping keep some of that ecosystem intact so that these farmers could then later reap the benefits of having these pollinators around for other benefits. We talked about pest control, pollination, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I know a lot of farmers are exploring silvopasture options and agroforestry and that kind of thing. So thinking native trees when you're making these plans and designs could be a really good opportunity.
Well, trees make great windbreaks for wind erosion control. So I mean, including these native trees for your windbreaks. I mean, think about also, we talked about common yarrow attracting a lot of benefits, attracting a lot of the beneficial insects that would act as pest control. Common yarrow is also a medicinal herb as well. So,
right.
I mean, the leaves and the flowers have medicinal value. This is often used in these herbal remedies. So, I mean, not only could you include it among your crops for pest control, but then at the end of the year, after it's done doing its thing, you could harvest it, leave the roots intact, and then you have something else that you're able to sell at a farmer's market or to a local natural food store.
Yeah.
Purple coneflower is another one. Echinacea is a thing that's an immunostimulant, and it's probably one of the most researched herbal remedies out there. It has been found through a lot of scientific research to have a lot of benefits. They've done a lot, especially over there in Europe, I believe, where a lot of research has taken place. But that's another one that is a butterfly magnet. So even if you're growing it, it's going to provide all kinds of other benefits. And then at the end of the year, you can harvest the above ground portion, and it'll grow back the next year. And it's again so beautiful in the landscape.
Yep. We have some of those growing at our place. It started out as one little one that took from some seed mix I threw, and it's grown and grown and grown. And when we were walking by it yesterday, I couldn't even count the butterflies. There were so many butterflies and so many different species. I'm not great at IDing butterfly species.
Me either.
But I was like, I got this swallowtail, big swallowtail, and then like all these different little ones, and it was just so cool to try and figure out how many different, but I couldn't. There were too many to count. It was so cool.
That's the thing too about some species of butterflies. The male and the female have different forms as well.
Yeah.
So and I did misspeak about coneflower. It's the roots that have the medicinal property that
I think the whole plant does.
Oh, does it? Okay.
I think so. I think I've read that like the root might have it more concentrated, but the leaves can too.
Gotcha.
So
when you talked about how they spread, if they're happy in an area, they will. So selectively harvesting, if it were the roots that you're trying to harvest, that is definitely a viable thing. And I mean, it's just, we have a nice patch out at our place, and it's just, we watch bumblebees, we watch butterflies, watch moths, we watch goldfinches come and land on them and eat the seeds. I mean, we just have a wide variety of different, other wildlife that depend on those. It's just great education just for the kids. I mean, see the kids out there just staring. They might go out to get clothes off the line and then get distracted by watching the bumblebees move from flower to flower. It's like, start to look like, where are they? You look out there, it's like, oh, we'll let them have that minute for I'm just glad they're out there watching.
Oh, yeah.
Enjoying it. So.
I just had this thought that, like, a lot of times farmers, we produce food and we get this totally amazing sense of fulfillment from like feeding our communities, like healthy food. And I just realized, I think you can get the exact same sense of fulfillment by feeding your ecosystem healthy food. Like just this excitement of like, I planted these native plants and now it's covered in butterflies. Like I get that same sense of like, I've done something good for the world, when you see that kind of thing.
Well, we have just a little less than an acre, and we have deer that will just wander through our yard and kind of eat our blackberries and whatnot, and we have everything from groundhogs to last fall we saw a covey of quail 3 different times. That was kind of our real big reward. Like, okay, this is why we're doing this.
Right.
I mean, we live near a national park that's doing a lot of quail habitat restoration. So I think we got some of the residual benefits from that. But when my wife purchased the land before we were married, it was an illegal dump site. A lot of household trash had been dumped out there by some people years and years before we had it. So we cleaned all that up, and it had been overtaken too by a lot of invasive species and noxious species, and we've been working to eradicate those, and we're still trying to get rid of Lespedeza and tall fescue. But we've been able to establish enough native plants that, just seeing the quail, moving around the property and the little covey, that was just a treat. Just knowing what that land used to be and knowing now, after 6-7 years, what it is supporting, So
that is so fulfilling.
Definitely. And then there's a whole, flowers. People want to, that might be able to grow flowers for farmers markets. I mean, there's a lot of native wildflowers like black-eyed Susans, purple coneflower, common yarrow that's going to be great in bouquets and whatnot. We, pick a few and put a little, in a vase on our table throughout the year. And we have our different seed, when we get in the late summer, we're starting to see more goldenrods and asters in our vase. But like this time of year, we got the purple coneflowers and the bergamot and bee-balms and all that. And so it just, I think that's another source of income.
Definitely.
One way to kind of, if you have a thick patch of one of these species, if kind of, clip some of them, thin them out a little bit, and give some space for the others to grow and still be economically viable or contribute to a farmer's income.
Yeah, and that is a really good point with a lot of these natives, learning how to harvest them so that they will come back.
Right. Yeah.
And we'll have a healthy population, like sustainable, into the future.
Definitely.
Is probably the key to having this
there's
work.
some annuals that, of course, rely on, going through their life cycle, producing seed to have the next year's population. But then the perennials, especially the herbaceous ones, are going to, regrow from the soil each year, like coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, that sort of thing. And so... it's about knowing the species and its growth pattern, and making sure that when you harvest it, that you're gonna make sure that they're included in the next year's growth. So.
And you mentioned goldenrod. That's another native.
Yeah, there's a lot of different species of native.
I just learned a few years ago that has medicinal properties.
It does. Yeah, the roots, flowers, and leaves. You can make a tea with it. It's diuretic, so it can be used if you have urinary tract infections. It's been used by the Native Americans for snake bites and fevers. It has a wide range of uses. And there are some that are considered more noxious in like a garden setting. We don't mind it so much at our place just because it supports native populations. A goldenrod beetle that depends a lot on goldenrod. But people that might live in a more urban or suburban environment might want to stick to certain goldenrod species that are a little better behaved in the garden, so to speak. To use one of
less aggressive.
Yes, yeah. So they're different. But for like a less managed area, or for something that's a little more out in the country, outside of town, a lot of these goldenrods are just fine, and they will. These native species that are aggressive, like some of the daisy fleabanes or the goldenrods, are also going to help with weed suppression. This is one that I would, I think would be great in areas under like utility corridors, power lines where they're trying to suppress, shrubs and trees and whatnot from growing instead of spraying. If we use these native aggressive species, then that's really going to help outcompete some of those native species. So there is a place for them, I think, in the landscape, in the managed or the built environment as well. So. Interesting.
That's a great point. I never thought about using native species to outcompete other species, less desirable species.
Right.
And I feel like a lot of the time we're talking about having to replace like Bermuda grass or fescue, which are they're pretty
They're pretty
tough,
aggressive, yes.
to get rid of. And so, replacing them with native species, you really have to fight for the space for the native species to be able to succeed.
There are a lot of native species that aren't that aggressive, and that's why they get out competed by those grasses. Like fescue is allelopathic, so it's able to kill a lot of those things off in the soil to help it out compete with the natives. But Bermuda grass, you want to take something and shade it out, we'll get a fast-growing native species in there, and it's going to shade out that shade-intolerant species. Some of it's knowing what invasive you're trying to control or what noxious species you're trying to control, and what conditions does it not like, and then what but there's some of those like tall fescue is going to be a little bit more of a issue. It's going to be a little more of a challenge, but that's not to say that it still couldn't be replaced. Somehow. Burning is one way to control tall fescue. To burn it in the spring, I believe is the time for burning to control it. And then if you have some native species that will grow and replace it before it's able to get reestablished, and sometimes that can be the way to do that.
Interesting. So yeah, you really have to learn what you're trying to control, its life cycle,
Exactly.
and then the life cycle of the other options to replace it.
Yeah.
To really get things working for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's some thought that has to be involved here, but that's not to say that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Wild Ones is here, is to help provide that guidance to landowners, land managers, to help them with that. We have a site committee where if you're located, Northwest Arkansas, then we have volunteers that will come out and give you advice or guidance on what could work out at your property.
Well, that's great. Yeah. So that's a great segue into I could just chat about native species all day, but this podcast is not supposed to be that long.
Right.
So I'd love to leave our listeners with some resources, books, places to go where they can go learn, find information about their own native plants in wherever they are in the country. Because what works here in the Ozarks is going to be very different from the Pacific Northwest.
Definitely. Yes.
So what are some things you could recommend people look for to learn more about this?
Well, on a national scale, I would think, there's Wild Ones is a pretty large organization nationally. We have chapters. We're not quite established in the Pacific Northwest, but we have chapters in Colorado and a lot of the eastern United States. So, going to wildones.org and finding out where your local chapter is might be an option. Either joining that chapter or reaching out to that chapter for help or guidance on what you're trying to do here in the Ozarks. We have our website for the Ozark chapter is ozark.wildones.org, and so we on our chapter website have a lot of resources on what native plants would grow given to certain site conditions at your property, where you can source your native plants. It's important to try to get local ecotypes as much as possible, and try to make sure that the seed came from populations generally, as close to the site as possible. 50 miles is probably going to be your depending on where you are and how much is available, is going to be, about the best you can do currently until, there's a lot more supply.
Right.
The demand is there. The supply seems to be still catching up to the demand for native plant species.
Now, that's another thing we should mention before we finish for the day.
Yes.
Is another way farmers could make money is potentially growing native plant
Exactly.
seeds or native plant starts.
Yes, there's
for sale.
a lot of interest and a lot of market demand right now for native plants, and then depending on where you are, and especially here in the Ozarks, the amount that's being produced is not able to meet that demand. And so, that's one thing that people could do, is start growing more native plants in their greenhouses. And there's other groups beyond just people that want to plant them in their gardens. There's state DOT, like the Department of Transportation, that has a need for native seed. Other farmers have a need for native seed if they're trying to use this stuff for on their properties or for native forage. There's a need by these large land managing agencies for native seed, and so growing a field of something where you're going to get a lot of seed is going to be very beneficial. There's some of these places are having to order their seed from as far away as either Pennsylvania or South Texas. Those aren't local ecotypes, so it's just the best they can currently do. So Jennifer Ogle here in Arkansas is heading up the Arkansas Native Seed Program, which is kind of a cooperative partnership between NRCS and Arkansas Game and Fish. Which reminds me, another agency that likes native plants, native seeds are going to be your U.S. Fish and Wildlife, your state conservation department or Game and Fish. They have wildlife food plots they try to plant in wildlife management areas, and they're always looking for native seeds, especially local ecotypes So that would be another potential place where this stuff could be sold. But the Arkansas Native Seed Program is trying to get more local native seed produced here in Arkansas for the market there.
Great. That's great to know.
Definitely.
Okay, so I interrupted you. I apologize. You were talking about
Well, I mentioned wild ones.
wild ones. Yeah.
A lot of states have a native plant society. Here in Arkansas, the Arkansas Native Plant Society, we have a blog that we come out with called Know Your Natives. And all of that's going to be more education on some of the more rare species in our state, or and it's got the more common ones too. But it's just great to learn about what might be on your property, to know what's native and what's not when you're deciding what might need to be removed, or what you might want to keep. Or what might be potentially a rare species that you want to help protect.
Right.
It adds value to your land. But we do guided hikes in the region. We do various outreach presentations, things like that. We have our membership meetings twice a year, so I just recommend people find out what their state native plant society is, and reach out to them or see about joining them and learning more about the native plants out on their properties or in the natural areas around where they live.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, this past year of working from home in the pandemic, I had more time to walk around our property than I ever had before. Yep. I need a 15-minute break from being at home with children. So I'm going to go for a walk in the woods. And I, with a little, plant identification app, or occasionally posting to Facebook,
Sure.
What is this plant? I learned so many new species that I never knew. And I've lived in the same place for like 14 years. So
I walk around our place and I see species, depending on what time of year, I might see a species I didn't see the previous year.
Right, it's hard to catch all the species that bloom throughout the year. So it is great to know what's there and what's beneficial and what could possibly be an invasive.
Right.
Catch it while it's small.
Exactly. Yeah, I have Japanese stilt grass at my property that the first year I didn't know what it was. Like, that's interesting. Second year, it's like, there's more of it. What is this? Third year, I learned what Japanese stilt grass was like. That's what that is.
Yeah.
And it's like really spread at that point. So I started looking into it and learned it's an annual. One way to get it is right before it's going to seed here in the mid to late summer. Last year I took a weed eater and just kind of whacked it all down. And so much of it, because it's an annual, the roots aren't that deep and it's easy to pull up. But that's an easier option when you don't have a ton of it.
Right.
And I was getting to a point where it was getting out of control. So I went after it with a weed whacker, and I know there's some seeds still on the ground that I'll have to go after again this year, but knowing that it's an annual and that I can control it that way, and hopefully not have to.
Right.
But yeah, that was one that surprised me.
Anyway, I keep distracting you. So Arkansas Native Plant Society, wild ones, and then
I was going to mention iNaturalist. Is that you mentioned
iNaturalist?
Apps. That's a great app to have on your phone to identify things. Even if you're not able to identify it, or if it doesn't know, what you could do is you save it. And then there are people that that's what they like to do is get on there and identify other plants that were not known or what people didn't know. And so I think you'll find if you upload some clear enough photos and enough of different parts of the plant, if you check it in a few days, a lot of times there's somebody that's gone on there and has figured out what it is for you. So,
that's great.
And it's a citizen science type effort because the more it gets uploaded to it, it has artificial intelligence that's able to get better at identifying things. So
cool.
It's it's it can usually at least get it down to a genus if it can't get it down to the species for you. But that's just another great resource. And other researchers and state agencies like Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission rely a lot on what people are posting to figure out, where are some of the invasives in our state, where are some of the native species that we might want to take interest in, if it's a species that might be considered a rare or threatened one, that sort of thing. So that's something that's used by conservation agencies as well. So you're helping out just by taking photos and uploading things to iNaturalist.
That's very cool.
And it does more beyond plants. It will do bugs, reptiles, mammals, all sorts of stuff.
Well, now I know what I'm going to do.
Yes.
That sounds fun. Any other resources you wanted to mention?
Not so much for. I mean, know of several great field guides that are going to be more specific to Arkansas, but I know the audience for this podcast is a little more broad than that.
But just like different, getting hold of a just regular native plant field guide wherever you are is a good resource.
Falcon guides, they usually have some native wildflower field guides for different regions across the country, and that's the way I started learning, was just taking a field guide hiking with me, and then I started learning more about plant keys and how to key out things, and so just learning about the flora that we have around us here in this region. Started off for me as just as a hiker backpacker, wanting to learn more about what I was seeing and what I might be able to nibble along on the trail and maybe cook at my campsite, and just kind of an enhanced outdoor experience. And eventually I started learning more about the non-edible, non-medicinal native plants and just the ecological benefits of it. And now I'm able to apply this knowledge professionally, especially when it comes to designing, beautiful, aesthetically pleasing rain gardens and bioswales and extension ponds, and, applying these phytoremediation concepts and native plants to the stormwater control infrastructure, to improve environmental quality while also providing benefits to wildlife and insects. So.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great, and I hope we've given people plenty of ideas so they can implement, put some native plants in on their property somewhere. Just start small and get planting.
Yep, start small and let it grow. And if anyone is interested in reaching out, I can leave my email address or...
Sure, I can link to it. Just put a link to it below the podcast on our website.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.